Every team, every topic, everywhere. This is Believe.
Ich warte seit Wochen auf diesen Tag und tanz vor Freude über den Asphalt. Als wär's ein Rhythmus, als gäb's ein Lied, das mich immer weiter durch die Straßen zieht. Komm dir entgegen.
Hello and welcome to Gegenpressing, the Bundesliga podcast. I'm Manu and Stefan, he's Stefan Bienkowski. First of all, Stefan, how's it going? How's your travels been? I know it's been a little bit of a longer one.
Yeah, it was a pretty crazy weekend. I think I spent on total maybe 26 hours in Germany. I was actually quite proud of how efficient I was, but it was nice to get to the game. Even though the contest on the pitch wasn't much, it was great to catch up with some old faces, one of which is joining us today.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about that. Someone both of us know quite well, Matt Ford from Deutsche Welle. Matt, first of all, very pleased to welcome you on the show. How's it going?
Yeah, cheers. Good evening, lads. Thanks for the invitation. And yeah, it's going well. I also made it back from Munich. Had a few transport issues similar to Stefan. So it's certainly been an eventful weekend for all of us on and off the pitch, hasn't it?
I think that's the dangers of dealing with Deutsche Bahn there, Matt.
Yeah, well, like we were saying at the game, I won't hear a bad word about Deutsche Bahn from two Brits, I'll put it that way, but yeah, we'll leave that to the Germans.
Yeah, you certainly don't get a free coffee when Northern Rail goes wrong in Manchester, so there you go. Even the delay was enjoyable.
Yeah.
Although I doubt Stefan would call it coffee.
Yeah, well, oh my God, do you know what? I don't think I've ever said a more controversial thing on Twitter. Do you know what's really weird? It wasn't even any Germans who kicked off about this. So I said on Twitter that, Germany just can't do coffee. But it was quite a lot of people who've lived in Germany who aren't there. I think there's one American guy, one Indian guy, maybe a guy from the UK, saying, "What are you talking about? The coffee's great." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? The coffee is not great."
I do have questions on how you drink your coffee though, Stefan, because
I'll tell you how I drink my coffee. I grind fresh coffee beans every morning, and then I put it in a French press, and then I drink it with some hot water and a dash of milk, like any real coffee connoisseur.
Okay.
But
I can see why you don't like the coffee then.
Yeah, it's really odd. But it was. Look, if that's the most controversial thing I had to say on Twitter the weekend, I'll chalk that up as a win.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll have to go to our break because we're obliged to, and then I'm sure you can say plenty of other controversial things on the show. So we'll get to that right after this break. This episode of the Gegenpressing podcast is brought to you by BetOnline. BetOnline remains your number one source for all your college basketball betting this season. Get analysis of every play, prop, and point at BetOnline. You'll find the latest odds, bracket contests, team matchups, and game trends at BetOnline. Updated odds for everything from live games, the conference championship, right through the Final Four and championship game. BetOnline is your college basketball headquarters this season. Head to the website today or use the mobile device to sign up and receive 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Be sure to use your promo code BELIEVE, BLEAV, BELIEVE, to receive your bonus. BetOnline.ag, where the game starts. So let's start with the Klassiker. And I might say something pretty controversial right to start with, something that might be even more controversial than Stefan's coffee takes. And people will be maybe a little confused about what I'm going to say right off the bat. I actually think that Dortmund did not play a terrible game in Munich. Now, let me get to why I think that, and then we can discuss it all around. I think there was a lot of spells in there where Dortmund actually looked quite good. Unfortunately, there was also a spell and they have this every time they come to the Allianz Arena. And that was right after Gregor Kobal's blunder, huge mistake that led to the 1-0. And then the absolute, the best way to describe it is deflation, where within a span of 20 minutes, Borussia Dortmund were smashed by Bayern Munich and effectively lost that match that way. And unfortunately, this happens every time that they're there. And it is, I think what really disappointed me about all of this is sort of the reaction that Dortmund had to a mistake like that. And they always seem to falter at the first. Every time they face adversity in Munich, they seem to just falter. They just don't seem to deal with it. It's sort of like you can see the entire team's shoulders just drop, the heads drop, and just not being able to cope. And I know both you, Stefan and Matt, you were both there. And I'm really curious what you make of that thought, because I think for a good 40 to 50 minutes, Dortmund were actually quite good, but they just gave it all away in that really quick spell. Maybe Matt, because you're the guest, I'm going to let you go first. What's your thoughts on all of that?
I think if you've been really, really kind to both yourself and Borussia Dortmund, you could maybe scrape together 40 minutes of half-decent performance, like you said. Obviously, those the opening 13 minutes would obviously be included. Dortmund were by far the better team. Really nice move before the Gregor Kobel error, I think involving Marius Wolf and Marco Reus. I think it was De Ligt who got in with a last ditch tackle. I believe was there also a chance for Guerrero, or half chance, slightly shortly after that. Dortmund looked good. The away end was bouncing. It was loud, and everything that we'd heard about, particularly from the director of sport, Sebastian Hoeneß, saying that Dortmund were going to be travelling to Munich with courage, with intent and with belief. For 13 minutes, it was absolutely there, and I thought we had a game on our hands. And then obviously, what happened. We've still got to make up another 27 minutes of good performance, haven't we? If we're going to make your 40, I think potentially in the second half, I thought Daniel Mahlen had a half decent cameo. I've not been overly impressed with him over the course of the season, to be honest. I think he has been getting incrementally better, but I do think he was a slightly brighter spark for Dortmund in the later in the second half. By which point, though, you have the massive caveat that the game was won for Bayern Munich. They were 4-0 up. It could easily have been 6 or 7 by that point. Does that make it 40 minutes for good performance? Can we compromise on 32 minutes of half decent performance?
10 minutes before the half where they were quite good too.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're kind of clutching at straws no matter what. I mean, I think you make a very good point.
I'm trying to be kind.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to literally count up to 40 to say that Dortmund they were undoubtedly very good at the start of the game, and I think up until, I mean, I was near enough live tweeting it in the first opening moments of the game, and I think it wasn't until the Emre Can yellow card that Bayern even managed a moment to kind of compose themselves. I mean, Dortmund looked composed. They looked really determined, and they looked like they're ready to take the game to Bayern. I thought Julian Brandt had some lovely touches and flicks in the opening moments of the game, and I thought, well, this could be a game changer, because not only is Brandt coming back from injury, but he seems to be match sharp rather, and fit, and he was quite happy to go toe-to-toe with Alphonso Davies, which I thought was really interesting. And him and Marius Wolf were having a great time down that right flank. But you guys are totally right about like the way that Dortmund kind of crept back into it towards the end of the game. And I think Tuchel actually made a point of that as well in his post-match interview. And I think there is actually something quite interesting to note from that, because, I mean, this is a really weird way to start analysing the game by starting with the final 18 minutes of it or something. But I think there's definitely a case to be said that, Dortmund played okay in parts of the game, but I think you could certainly make an argument that Bayern weren't even particularly good for most of the game. Yeah. I think obviously the opening goal was a complete calamity from Cabell. And the second goal was, in my opinion, just really dreadful defending from, I think it was Schlotterbeck who was marking De Ligt. I've got it. I've actually got the highlights in front of me, and I just wanted to double check this before.
It was either Süle or Schlotterbeck.
It was number 4 for Dortmund, who I think is Schlotterbeck. I'm literally just double checking here. Number 4, yeah, it's Schlotterbeck. So
Schlotterbeck.
Schlotterbeck got caught underneath De Ligt, and then Thomas Müller did what Thomas Müller does, and then obviously this third
Although
goal.
Brandt completely leaves him alone. Like, Brandt should completely leaves Müller unmarked there. He just stands next to him.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
I thought there was actually a slight irony, I thought, in the way those first two goals came about. Like you were saying, Stefan, there is a slight argument to be had that Bayern themselves didn't actually play as well as we know they can, and there's all sorts of reasons for that. Obviously, Thomas Tuchel only had barely one training session with his team, so that's all fair enough. But obviously, the build of the first goal, it comes from an absolutely terrible pass from Dayo Upamecano. It's overhit, it's aimless, it was completely unimaginative, and yet somehow it's ended up rolling into the back of the net. Similarly with the second goal, Matthias de Ligt, it's effectively a free header, and he's put it wide. He's put that header a good yard wide. Yeah. And obviously Thomas Müller has put himself in the right space as he so brilliantly and so often does. So yeah, there's even an argument to say that even those two Bayern goals weren't even particularly well prepared.
And Thomas Müller's goal, he doesn't even tap it in. It hits off his it looks like it hits off his hip.
It hits him by accident almost. Yeah, and he's just there like.
Yeah, and I was saying to someone after the game, actually, I was kind of watching back Leroy Sané's shot, at least the third goal, and I'm not even sure if that's actually on target. It looked like it was maybe going wide. I know Cabell, and I think it's really, I kind of tweeted this after the game, and I think a lot of people made a point of it that, Gregor Cabell was very mature and he was very courageous in the way he came out and spoke to the media after the game, and, he talked about the first goal. He did kind of say that he didn't think he did anything wrong for the third goal, which I'm not entirely sure I agree with, to be honest. Manu, you're a card-carrying member of the goalkeeping.
That's his.
It's strong criticism, this though.
Yeah, no, Stefan. But honestly, that's his.
So you're saying?
Let's say it does go wide and he goes for it. That's fine, but then he has to have it.
Hold on. Let me just get this straight. Are you, Manu, saying that he should have done better there, or that we're being unfair? Okay.
No, that's his. That goal is that's chalked up as a goalie mistake. Look, if you go down like that, and if the ball bounces off you, that's bad already. But if it does need to bounce off you, it shouldn't bounce forward. It should always bounce sideways, ideally away from the goal, right? That's if you go for that ball. Let's say I'm not sure it would have gone wide, and that's, as a goalkeeper, you were supposed to go for it rather than trust that it goes wide, right? But it shouldn't bounce off you.
I think if you are being overly critical, I think it's fair. You can perhaps expect that to be turned further away from the goal or around the post, but I think that's quite high level criticism, to be honest.
Yeah. It didn't make or break the game, but
no, I mean, also like I said, actually, credit to Müller. I know it's been said a million times. I know I'm not inventing the wheel here, but it's my immediate reaction both times was it must be a fluke that it just keeps dropping to him, but. I mean, it's not though, is it? When it happens time and time again, season after season, that Thomas Müller is just constantly in the right place at the right time, then it's not a fluke. And I'm just reminded of that every time I see Bayern Munich in the flesh, which admittedly is a lot less than I see Borussia Dortmund. That's purely down to geography. I'm based in the west of Germany, not down south. So yeah, on the occasions that I do then see Bayern Munich, it never ceases to amaze me just how constantly and ceaselessly Müller just pops up. His reading of the game is absolutely second to none. And if it bounced in off his pelvis or whatever part of his body it bounced off, fair play to him.
Yeah, I think it is probably just a coincidence, but it feels like such a kind of delicious kind of, and maybe it's an irony or something that, or just a really tasty narrative that it was Muller that kind of led the charge in Thomas Muller's first game in charge, where, I was quite lucky enough to cover for Andy Brasso for The Guardian this week, and I wrote the Bundesliga column, and I made the point that, he's a player who was kind of somewhat marginalised by Nagelsmann, not entirely, dropped from the team or anything, but he often was benched and then came back in and somewhat sidelined by Musiala, kind of moving into that number 10 role. And I did speak to someone at the club after the game about, what had happened with Nagelsmann and Tuchel, and the point they made was, look, Nagelsmann he was mucking about with Muller. You don't drop Muller at Bayern Munich. You simply don't do that. He has to play every game. He is Mr. Bayern, and there's consequences if you try and sideline him, and that's what happened with Nagelsmann. And I don't think it was a coincidence that Thomas Muller played like his life depended on it on Saturday. He was outstanding. And then the point I kind of made in my column was that you could draw a very stark contrast to the way that Marco Reus kind of embodied this kind of really bizarre, well, maybe not bizarre if you've been watching the Bundesliga long enough, but in the moment it seemed quite bizarre, quite daunting, the way that Dortmund just completely capitulated and kind of just looked like rabbits caught in the headlights in that game.
Can we talk about that some more? Because I think that is the other point that I made in my opening remark is I find it unbelievable that a professional team would collapse like that in such a short time. Why was there no one in this Dortmund squad? And that includes pretty boy Jude Bellingham, who is everyone is so full of praise of. No one stood up to this.
Well,
the entire team just absolutely collapsed.
Yeah,
you have to be careful here, though, Manuel. The M word has been banned in Dortmund. So I hope you're not suggesting we talk about the banned M word.
The banned M word.
Meaning mentality.
Okay, yeah, mentalität.
Mentalität.
Let me ask you this, Matt, because I know we're on the same row, but we're a few seats apart. But did you notice? This is the first thing that I noticed when that first goal went in. The only player who went back to Kobel to kind of, trying to console him for what happened was Marius Wolf. And it really, I found it so interesting that the rest of the team just kind of stood there with their hands on their hips, almost kind of stunned and stuck in place. Where, we've all seen goalkeepers make massive howlers. It happens from time to time. And it happens at every level of the game. And in every level of the game, you usually have 3 or 4 guys, if not the whole team, going over to him, trying to reassure the keeper and say, look, you made a mistake, but it's fine, we'll make up. And I just thought it was so interesting that as soon as that goal went in, and then, in fact, Marco Reus basically made this point in the post-match interview, I think it was with Sky Sports, where he said, look, the manner in which the first goal happened and then the second goal happened straight afterwards, hey, look, we're just human. What are we supposed to do when you go 2-0 down like that in Munich? And I just thought, and I kind of made this point in my Guardian article, I was like, I know it's a really mean thing to say, but if you want to kind of chalk Thomas Muller up as Mr. FC Bayern and the guy who really represents that Mia San Mia attitude, and the guy who is sitting there before every match singing about how Bayern Munich are the best and they're number one, etc., and he really believes it, it feels to me like Marco Reus is the kind of Dortmund version of that, where he's an extremely talented player. He's capable of really scoring against any team in the Bundesliga, but when it comes to these crunch games, particularly against Bayern in Munich, this Dortmund just seem to have this kind of inferiority complex.
I mean, perhaps the amount of times he's had to go through it, Marco Reus. Perhaps there is there's some some degree of understanding for that. I also thought his comments after the game were quite uninspired. I think you highlighted a couple, Stefan. I think the one I highlighted was just I think I even wrote that it could have been a recording. He might as well have recorded the excuses down the years and just trot them out each time it happens. We played badly. We deserved to lose. That was it. Going back to the goal, I watched it as well. I also found it strange that, particularly given the position that Kobel found himself on just outside the penalty area, that actually made him physically closer to some of his teammates, and still it was only Marius Wolf who approached him by the time he'd got back to his goal, and even then it was only a very sort of cursory, like chest bump sort of thing before he ran off again. And I think, like we said, the extent to which the shoulders dropped and the body language dropped, it was almost visible. You could visibly see all that courage and self-belief and intent from the first 13 minutes. You could almost see it leave those Borussia Dortmund players, and so it proved to be in the succeeding 10 minutes. I'm not going to put it all down to Borussia Dortmund and some sort of weak psychological mentality. I think it's difficult to avoid it completely, but I'm still very reluctant to accuse any team of professional footballers at this level of lacking the right mentality. And I think I really don't think that's really acceptable. What was also true about those next 10 minutes where Bayern scored those two more goals, just the aggression in the pressing reminded me of Bayern under Hansi Flick. They were absolutely swarming Borussia Dortmund. There was no way out, and as good as Julian Brandt has been this season, even adding a hard work rate and a more physical side to his game, as rock solid as Jude Bellingham has been, there was absolutely no answer to it. They were absolutely swarmed, and that's perhaps a slightly better explanation than just mentality, even though the questions do need to be asked.
But that's typical Bayern, isn't it? I mean, I am fortunate enough to see them quite a lot live, because where I'm based in Germany is in Munich, right, when I'm there. So I do go to quite a lot of their games every season, and when they smell blood in the water, they are a bunch of sharks. They will go in for the kill. And whether that's Dortmund or any other team, that's how they operate, right? And especially when they are put in a situation where the coach has just been fired. And, quite a lot of Bayern Munich players have said that Joshua Kimmich is leading by example here, right? That they feel responsible for the firing. And I think that is maybe the other flip side of that when you talk about mentality, even though, Matt, apparently that word is banned in Dortmund. Maybe they need to reintroduce it. But Bayern Munich have that mentality that when they are with their backs to the wall and then brought into a situation where they can not only free themselves, but also absolutely murder their opponent, they will do it, right?
Yeah, I think, it's really tricky, obviously, to kind of apply kind of any kind of logic to something as inconceivable as mentality or something, but I do just keep coming back to thinking it must come down to the type of players you have in that team, and I think, I do feel like there's a big difference between the way Thomas Muller conducts himself and the way that Marco Reus conducts himself. Maybe it's because of the experience that they have had in their careers today, that Muller has simply always been used to winning games, and he's always been used to the expectation to win games. And so it's just ingrained in him. And similarly, Marco Reus has spent most of his career probably extremely frustrated with the circumstances at Dortmund. So, maybe once upon a time he was this kind of hungry, really desperate for success, and that's maybe been chipped away over the years. But I just think if you were to swap Muller and Reus around in that game, I do wonder if the result would have been different. I feel like it's maybe that strong. It felt that palpable to me in the stadium that day. And I think it's really interesting you mentioned the Bellingham thing, because I think he was really quite crucial to it as well. I kind of made the point on Twitter going into the game that Dortmund had a great opportunity to really attack Bayern in the middle of the pitch because, I just feel like Kimmich and Goretzka just haven't been very good this season. And for the first time in a long time, Dortmund had this kind of dynamic midfield of Can, Guerrero, and Bellingham. But in the end, the three of them just kind of fell apart. And I felt like in particular Bellingham just kind of he went really notably missing in this game. And I kind of wrote a kind of full-time quick analysis piece for the Substack, and I made the point that I think a lot of Dortmund's problems could have been summed up through, what seemed to me fitness issues with Gregor Kobel, Sebastian Haller didn't look anywhere near match fit, which, as I made in the point, or as I made in the article, is by no means his own fault, and it's not something that we could or should criticize him for, but it's a call that Terzic probably should have made. But it also felt to me like Bellingham was completely missing a yard or two in his game, because it felt like where he usually has the the fitness capacity, he has the stamina to be a box-to-box midfielder. It felt to me like he spent most of this game just trying to play this kind of drifting number 10 role, and more often than not, it meant Emre Can was running around chasing shadows. It meant Rafael Guerreiro kept drifting out left because it's probably instinctive in his game, but also because Marco Reus was drifting inside and leaving a whole massive flank for no one to really step into. And all of a sudden, Dortmund went from having a 3-man midfield to having a 1-man midfield. And I think that played a huge part in allowing Bayern to just kind of really dominate that game.
I think Emre Can, too, taking himself out early with that yellow card really hurt Dortmund just before the first goal, right? But you mentioned Bellingham's fitness issue. I think it's also telling that Schlotterbeck is now out with an injury. He probably shouldn't have started. And I'm going to put this to you then, Matt. In a game like that, if you know that your center back and several other players aren't fit, why wouldn't you start Mats Hummels?
I think the answer is probably pace in one word. I mean, I can only imagine that's Terzic's thinking there. I don't want to look for too many excuses for Borussia Dortmund's collapse, because I think it happens so often that it really is starting to become a little bit inexcusable. But so many things have once again come into play this season which have affected Edin Terzic's preparations. Stefan, you touched on quite a few of them there. You mentioned Sebastian Haller. Obviously, nobody could have predicted, and certainly no one would have in any way hoped that such a diagnosis would happen to Sebastian Haller, and that he'd have to go through what he went through. And it's an absolute miracle that he's even playing professional football so soon after that. However, you're not on your own. Sorry, in raising doubts. About his fitness. I think everyone has the utmost respect and understanding for where he's come from, but at the end of the day, at some point a line is crossed where we're working here. He's a professional footballer. We're working professional football. You have to perform. You have to score goals. You have to get results. And at what point does it become acceptable or indeed necessary to start measuring Sebastian Haller by the same standards as everybody else? And I think that has been asked by some colleagues of mine in Dortmund. Obviously, the club haven't necessarily liked hearing that. They've understandably defended Haller. That's also fine. But I do wonder if, particularly the role that was assigned to him, I think as much as it makes sense in principle, this idea of him dropping a bit deeper as a bit of as a pivot, as the intention is for him to drop into more of a number 10 role and sort of link up attacks in that way, and he has got a good touch in that sort of position, certainly much better than Anthony Modeste. I wonder if that was really the way to go about damaging Bayern Munich, given that the teams which do have joy against Bayern, it's often heavily counter-attack based. Definitely much more heavily based on quicker counter-attacks down the flanks, thinking in particular of the relative success that Borussia Mönchengladbach have had in recent years against Bayern. They've got a pretty good record against them, with the pace that the likes of Alassane Player and Markus Thuram and Jonas Hoffmann and others offer. I can think back to even this season, the goal or the equaliser that Eintracht Frankfurt scored was based on the pace of Kolo Muani. There are countless examples of Bayern getting caught out at the back for pace, because neither Upamecano and De Ligt, neither of them are the quickest. So I wonder if perhaps the Terzic did get it then tactically wrong by going for that Haller pivot role rather than perhaps starting Marlon and Moukoko. Although even there, I totally understand why you wouldn't. I've got my doubts about both of them. I'm not sure if Marlon has offered the quality. Certainly not meriting. It was 30 million, wasn't it? They paid for him.
Yeah,
it's quite a significant amount, and I also wouldn't put too many expectations on Youssoufa Moukoko, just purely given the lad's age. So when you put all those things together, you do find that Edin Terzic is perhaps in quite an unenviable position there.
And I completely agree with you, because I definitely think you're right in saying that Daniel Malin has had something of a renaissance in the second half of the season, but for the most part it has come about as him playing as this kind of impact sub for Dortmund, and I think that was clearly all for all to see on Saturday when he did come on, and he came up against a Bayern defence that was either tired or by that point extremely complacent because the game was finished, and he had a great degree of success by just running into the gaps in that team. But whether he could have been able to do that from the first minute, I completely agree with you that Terzic may have his doubts. I think one player they probably really missed now in hindsight was probably Adeyemi, because I know he isn't really a number 9 per se, but even just having someone like that to kind of lump the ball up to, who can run onto long balls, who can kind of beat De Ligt and Upamecano for pace, I think would have made a big difference. And I think actually when we did our preview show last week, one of the points I made was that I could really see like a kind of upfront duo of kind of Sebastian Haller and Adeyemi causing a lot of trouble for this Bayern team, because a fully fit Haller, I think, probably has a good job or has a good chance of frustrating Upamecano in the kind of physical battle, which I think Upamecano sometimes struggles with, in the sense that not that he's not physical enough, but almost that when he does get into these kind of tussles, he overcompensates by being extra physical, and that's when he gets clumsy. So I could see, I did kind of think, well, maybe Haller could have played that role, and then of course someone like Adeyemi could play in behind De Ligt, and that could have caused problems for Bayern. But what we instead got was what looked like extremely half-fit Sebastian Haller, which I think really puts that international break into context, where Dortmund were not happy that he went off with his national team. And I know he only played about 60 or 70 minutes, I think, but even just the fact he had to travel and play and probably take part in training sessions obviously had some sort of impact. The fact that he wasn't fully fit, you then had, the 3 players behind him, if I'm not mistaken, were Royce, Bellingham and Julian Brandt. The Royce thing, I don't want to go back to Royce. I'm not going to pick on him again too much again, because I know we did talk about it, but putting his mentality to one side, even his role in this game was extremely confusing, because he started on the left but continued to drift inside, and it was as if him and Bellingham were almost stepping on each other's toes. But it also then meant that Kimmich and Goretzka had so much little space to actually cover. And one thing that really stood out to me after Bayern kind of had essentially won the game, Dortmund still really struggled to have an outball to pass to in the Bayern half, because obviously Haller wasn't able to make the runs, and Bellingham and Marco Reus were basically holding hands in between Kimmich and Goretzka, and it just fell apart entirely, really. And that's why Terzic obviously took the first opportunity he got in the second half by pulling Reus off.
Well, I think all the things you've listed there, and I think as a conclusion perhaps to all that, it just shows the extent to which absolutely everything has to go right from the perspective of Borussia Dortmund or RB Leipzig or whoever it might be who's claiming to be some sort of challenger to Bayern Munich in any given season. Absolutely everything has to fit. Edin Terzic And I do have some sympathy for him that he's very much learning on the job, and he's been forced to be learning on the job and making things up as he goes along a little bit this season because of the injury. I totally agree about Adeyemi. He would have been a great option. However, even his narrative this season has been one of frustration. I think he got injured in the first home game and then was out for several months before having to find his form again. Marlon and Mokoku did offer an outlet afterwards, but as we said, far too late for that. You need all these things to come together, and when just one of them doesn't, then the qualitative gap, which is a direct result of the financial gap between the two, it just becomes absolutely insurmountable. And that's what happens when a team the size of Bayern Munich wins 10 titles on the bounce, with the added Champions League revenue that comes with that, and the ability to sell much bigger sponsorship deals and boost revenue streams on a scale that even Borussia Dortmund can't compete with.
Can I counter that real quick? Because you're absolutely right about everything you say. And everything has to go right for you to win in Munich. Yet there's plenty of other teams this year that went to Munich with smaller budgets than Dortmund and did a lot better. And I want to add to that as well that I think if Borussia Dortmund had lost this game 4-2, I don't think anyone would have complained. Like, if just based on the result, I think, if this would have been a 4-2 and it would have gone back and forth. So it's sort of like the game last year, right, where Haaland made it 2-0 really quickly. I think it's once again the manner. I think you can lose in Munich, and that's fine. But we have seen so many other teams this year go to the Allianz with a far better attitude, right? With a lot smaller budget than Dortmund's. And yet it's always Borussia Dortmund that come up with this result. I think, look, in football, it's quite normal that you lose at the Allianz Arena. Teams with much bigger budgets and revenue than Dortmund, in some cases even maybe than Bayern, have gone to the Allianz and got smashed there. Yeah. I think for me, what bothers me the most here is that, Dortmund will say, oh, it's the money, it's the revenue, it's like, we're just a smaller team. It's like, but because you always pointing this out is the reason why you always lose there. You know what I'm getting at? Yeah,
I'm sure Matt has a response, but I'll jump in there too as well, just to say that I do get the impression, though, whenever this game comes along, that Bayern definitely relish beating Dortmund.
Totally.
And I think that's an important point here, because maybe Gladbach maybe are getting to the point where Bayern actually do have to pay attention to these fixtures when they come up. But the likes of Frankfurt or Union Berlin or whoever else, when they beat Bayern, it's a complete shock, because no one expected it to happen, least of all Bayern, so they get caught by surprise. But whenever Dortmund play Bayern, half the world calls it their Klassiker, even though it's not, and we can probably spend the whole episode talking about that ill-fated name and how it's actually come to kind of represent this curse that Dortmund have, in the sense that, once upon a time they had the audacity to be good for 2 or 3 seasons under Jurgen Klopp, and since then Bayern have gone out of their way to put them in their box and keep them there. And I think that's probably going to stay the case until guys like Thomas Müller and Manuel Neuer retire and a new generation of players come through who never have considered Dortmund as domestic rivals, even guys like maybe like Joshua Kimmich, when he steps into a more senior role, when someone like Müller retires, he may even now probably think, well, Dortmund's just Dortmund. They're no better than Leipzig or anyone else. Obviously they've got the fan support, they've got the stadium, and they have a history which is different. But in terms of a sporting threat to Bayern, it's maybe not. And I think that's why it's different. I think Bayern do set up and make sure they don't lose to Dortmund in a way that they don't with most other rivals in the Bundesliga.
Yeah, big game Bayern,
I think you're right in that, to an extent, that role of a challenger does automatically get thrust onto Borussia Dortmund. And again, I don't mean this to come across as like some defensive, or this is poor Borussia Dortmund being put into this role. I don't want to come across like that, but Stefan is right that they are seen as that. They're seen as that by Bayern, which influences their performance. They're seen as that by the league, which markets this game as the Klassiker, which sort of gives the impression that it's some sort of clash of equals, but it's quite simply not. And I also think that I don't know, that potentially influences Borussia Dortmund's approaches to these games. And we go back to that tactical issue I mentioned before about almost trying to go like for like against Bayern with Haller into that pivot role, whereas perhaps, say, for example, earlier, just a couple of months ago, FC Köln went away to the Allianz Arena with absolutely zero expectations. However, they did that lack of expectation to get anything out of the game did almost give them a freedom to nail down one very, very concrete plan and nothing else, and that was sit back, sit behind the ball, hit him on the break, and then that's absolutely it. Nothing else is expected of us, and they got away. They got away with a 1-1 draw, and it would have been a win if it was the equaliser came from a Joshua Kimmich screamer. So they almost got 3 points out of it. Does the context around Borussia Dortmund prevent them from going to Munich and playing like that, or playing like a Gladbach, or playing like an Union Berlin? Does that stop them doing it subconsciously?
Well, but it wasn't a tactical issue that undid them. It was individual mistakes. And then,
in this case, of course it was. But I do wonder, in the greater scheme of things, were the tactics wrong as well? Although you're right, in this particular case, of course, the actual goals came from just disastrous.
Because I think tactically they were actually set up really well.
Offs. Yeah.
To start, and we saw that in the beginning of the match, right? And it's just that, I mean, you're quite right. Like, maybe that in your head is like, oh, we have to match them, and then they, at the first instance where they find out that it's still not enough, they just deflate.
You almost have to break that mold somewhat, and this might surprise you to see me sort of using RB Leipzig as like a positive example, but particularly in their first season in the Bundesliga, and arguably a couple of times since, where they have, at least for periods of the season, gone toe to toe with Bayern, but without that entire context around it. Obviously, we can all criticise them for the lack of tradition and the whole thing around them, but it did allow them to go there with a completely blank slate, no expectations, and not burdened by this big contextual machine and narrative that goes on around the whole thing. And that's ultimately, it's not helped them either. They've also not come close to challenging Bayern in the long term, but perhaps
they challenged them in 90 minutes. They do challenge them in 90 minutes.
They do. And I think that's because they, in their own way, managed to break the mold to a certain extent, which Borussia Dortmund don't do.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting comparison. And I mean, I think there's also a little bit, again, you can say about the construct itself, everything you want, but I think there's also a different mentality among Leipzig players in games like that. They're not taught, they're not necessarily held back by history, maybe. Maybe we need a psychologist to come on here, guys. Help us explain this.
Someone pass the psychologist number on to Borussia Dortmund as well while they're at it.
I'm pretty sure they actually have a psychologist.
To Matt's point about how Dortmund get labelled as the de facto challengers, it's interesting in the sense that, if you look at the teams in the division, Dortmund aren't the side that just won the Europa League. That's Frankfurt. And, obviously Frankfurt on a trajectory, they're not nearly as big as they possibly could be. But, that's fine. But it's interesting that the Europa League winners aren't considered a challenger, but Dortmund still are. And you can even look at RB Leipzig, who, regardless of how they make their money and who gives it to them, they probably now rival Dortmund in terms of wage budgets, how much money they spend in the market, if not surpass them. And they still don't get labelled as title challengers. And, and hopefully Dortmund fans who listen to the show and are probably, frustrated at people like us who call them challengers. I think Manu and I, to our credit, did say this, when Leipzig began to fall apart this season. We said, look, if this club wants to be serious, they have to, if they're going to spend the money they're spending, if they are comparable to Dortmund in terms of the money they spend, they should have to have the same expectations. And, everyone likes to laugh at Dortmund because they keep slipping on the banana skin every season. But if Leipzig are going to do the same thing, they have to get similar critique, So
I totally agree, Stefan. I mean, we're getting slightly off topic a bit, but it's actually been a criticism of mine among many of RB Leipzig that purely on the pitch, I think, for the resources at their disposal and the unique situation in terms of the structure that they find themselves in, I think a single German Cup win on penalties is a pretty poor return, but that's a slightly different topic.
Which we maybe, but can we maybe to wrap up this topic, because we do also have to talk about the coaching change. And I know the Klassiker is the big topic, and which is why we devoted 90% of this podcast to it. But before we do move to the coaching change, we have to really underline here that this title race is not over. Because in the end of the day, it's only 3 points, and Bayern Munich, and I'm convinced by this, guys, that there is another slip up coming, because Thomas Tuchel is not just going to step in here now and win every single game until the end of the season. That's simply not going to happen. And so I want to take this to you two as well. Do you think the title race is over?
I'll
go on,
let
Stefan. You can start. Go on.
Well, do you know what? I do have a point to make about this, because I kind of said this at the start of the show about Tuchel complaining about the way that Bayern played in the post-match and how they kind of not fell apart, but they obviously let Dortmund creep back in with 2 goals in the second half. And I think it's going to be really interesting to watch Bayern over the next couple of weeks, because yes, they had this kind of perfect start, or Tuchel had this perfect start to the league campaign against Dortmund, but you could probably make a fair case that just about anyone could have been sitting in that dugout that day, and each of these Bayern players would have worked their socks off, because, as we've talked about already on the show, that, Bayern and every player at Bayern know that they have to win the games against Dortmund. It's just ingrained in the club over the last kind of 10 years. And the point that, and I'm not trying to just rile up Bayern fans here, that I don't think the club or the team actually played particularly well on the day, especially in the second half. And I think that's probably something that Tuchel will probably be kind of focusing on, rather than Thomas Müller scoring 2 goals or, Upamecano scoring a wonder goal from his own half. I think he'll be focused on the fact that those complacencies that led to Nagelsmann's downfall were actually still there. And luckily, Dortmund shot themselves in the foot before they could do anything about it. But they've got a double header now against Freiburg, who are no pushovers. Then they have Manchester City in the Champions League, who look utterly terrifying at the moment. If anyone follows the Premier League, they routinely dismantled Liverpool as if they were, a League Two side in the third round of the FA Cup without Erling Haaland. And then they've got a kind of, a tricky run before the end of the season. So I think Tuchel still has a lot of work to do to elevate this team beyond the kind of complacent side that it has been this season, which is, as you said, Manu, a team that does continue to routinely drop points. And actually, I can't remember which Dortmund player it was, or maybe it was Terzic himself who said this after the game. He said, look, if we do have any kind of hope to cling on to here, it's the fact that we've made up so many points on Bayern since the turn of the year.
It's Bellingham.
Was it? Okay. And simply losing to them in this game doesn't mean we can't continue to do that. And I think that's maybe a fair point, unless Tuchel can very quickly turn things around at the club.
Matt, your thoughts?
I think it's pretty impossible to judge Thomas Tuchel at the moment. I think everything went Bayern's way on Saturday. A lot of that is deservedly so. Like I said, I don't think Thomas Müller gets in those positions by a fluke. I think they know what they're doing. But Tuchel did say before the game, his quote was, "Less is more." He had no time to make big changes. He's not stamped his mark on this team yet. He'd be the first to admit that. I don't really think we saw much of a Thomas Tuchel style in particular on Saturday. I don't think it was necessary. I don't think it was even possible to have seen that. So difficult to predict which way that'll go. The only thing I would say is that I think even though they are 2 points clear now, and even though I think a Bayern Munich team under Nagelsmann would probably have won on Saturday, I do think a Nagelsmann Bayern would have another couple of slip-ups in them between now and the end of the season. I'm a fan of Nagelsmann's. I think he's a good coach, and I think his time will come. I'm an even bigger fan of Thomas Tuchel. And I think the fact that he showed in such a short space of time at Chelsea how quickly and how decisively he can deliver results, he's a proven winner, a proven success story at the top level. I can't see them slipping up. Certainly not in the Bundesliga. I think the game against Manchester City will be a particular test for him. That'll be a fascinating one to watch, especially if it seems that Pep Guardiola has found a way to win without Erling Haaland, and perhaps even be better without Erling Haaland as a big number 9. So that'll be an interesting challenge to see how Tuchel measures up to that. But in terms of the Bundesliga, unfortunately for any Borussia Dortmund fans listening, I still see them slipping up as slightly more likely, especially because their running is tougher as well.
There you got it. All right. Speaking of coaches, Stefan, you will be maybe rejoicing that your favorite club, VfB Stuttgart, has once again sacked their head coach. Bruno Labbadia is gone, and it was a quick turnaround. Sebastian Hoeneß, the new head coach. I know you have a lot of thoughts on both, so I'm going to dedicate the segment to you.
Hey, it doesn't even have to be a segment. It's simply a case of saying I told you so. And no, of course not. Like, it was a bizarre appointment in the first place. It hasn't worked out at all. And, my thoughts on the way Stuttgart have conducted themselves this season are well documented in this show. That it's just kind of beggars belief. And I've got a lot of sympathy for Stuttgart fans because, it's not fair on them. And I wrote an article, like I think I said this on Twitter over the weekend. I wrote an article when they appointed Bruno Labbadia, and I kind of said, and as a critique of Stuttgart, not to rile up fans, but to try and, I was actually in defence of the fans because it felt to me like Stuttgart had fallen into that very modern Bundesliga trap of becoming a club that just develops youth players to sell to the Premier League without any real key sporting ambition behind it. And I think that's what's kind of tripped up Stuttgart in his last 2 or 3 seasons, where they have had impressive squads, and obviously Materazzo did a decent job with them, but each summer 1 or 2 players get chipped away. There's at least 2 or 3 players in this team who are desperate to leave in the summer. And I think if you compare that to a club like Schalke right now, who you can see are working their socks off every single week to try and stay in the division, the fans are behind them. They're not a squad full of young players who have no connection to the club or interest really in even where the club plays its football next season. It's a lot of kind of journeymen. It's a lot of senior players, a lot of I don't want to say German players because it doesn't really matter if they're German or local or anything, but it's a lot of players who understand the situation Schalke are in. And I just find that more appealing as a neutral, and I think fans probably appreciate it more too. And I don't know if that makes me kind of orthodox or old-fashioned or whatever you want to call it, but yeah, that was my critique of Stuttgart at the time. Having said all that, I think Sebastian Hoeneß is a really talented head coach. I think Hoffenheim's demise since he left has proved that point. I'm really intrigued that he's taken up this role at this point. Maybe he thinks he can, even if they get relegated, he can still do a decent job there next season. But he's the head coach they probably should have appointed in January. Whether he can do anything about it now, I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Yes, of course, a bit of a family connection there with his father, Dieter Hoeneß, having been a sporting director there. So maybe that played a little bit of a role. But Matt, before we wrap this up, your thoughts on this?
I think not much to add to what Stefan was saying about the way the Stuttgart have progressed or regressed in recent years. But just looking at the bigger picture, the Stuttgart are an absolutely classic example of these huge, big, traditional, historic German football clubs who just can't seem to get the management structures and streamlined management strategies right. Whether it's a case of simply too many cooks spoiling the broth at a club, because you don't see it at Stuttgart, you see it at Cologne, a perfect example from time to time. Schalke, as you mentioned, have been the absolute prime example of that in recent years. It unfortunately is a negative side of the way these huge German football clubs are run. They are run on a semi-democratic basis. There is an awful lot of politicking that goes on around these clubs, particularly in a location such as Stuttgart, where the regional business interests have always been so closely entwined with the club. The big industry in the southwest of Germany being effectively the centre of the German automobile industry, Mercedes and the like, have always had their own political and industrial interests in Wolfsburg, Stuttgart. The irony is, Stefan mentioned before how Stuttgart did build a reputation for themselves as a good academy, a good producer of youth talents. We've just spoken a lot about Joshua Kimmich, haven't we? Also originally came through Stuttgart. In recent years, it was actually Thomas Hitzelsberger who was running up, who was heading up Stuttgart's youth academy before quickly making a move, perhaps prematurely, into the higher hierarchies, higher up the club, before himself falling victim to the various political intrigues which go on around the club. Nowadays, I think Sami Khedira is back at the club in some sort of role. His precise role escapes me for the time being. Like I said, it's very much for all the positives that that German football fans talk about, with the 50+1 rule and member influence and a degree of democratic organisation in these clubs. It also means that you have a lot of people involved with lots of different interests, and that can sometimes come at the expense of clear professional management, which leads to the sort of crises which we seem to constantly see at Stuttgart, at Hamburg, at Schalke, at Cologne, you name it.
Yeah. Well, I think that you guys sum it up really well. And unfortunately, we're almost out of time, because we could probably do an entire podcast just on that, mega clubs in German football, and how they're kind of sometimes in their own way with the structures that they have put in place. But as I said, Matt, I think if we open that can of worms, we're here all day. And unfortunately, we don't have that much time left. But we'll have to bring you back. I think that's the solution here. As always, the show is brought to you by Bet Online. But before we wrap this up, Matt, where can people find you, and what are you working on?
The best place to find me is on Twitter, I suppose. So Matt_4D. My work's on Deutsche Welle, DW, and my immediate focus is Borussia Dortmund's next fixture. I should be there on this upcoming Saturday, I believe it is, at home to Union, a game which has taken on even greater importance now, given Union's big win over Stuttgart at the weekend. They're now looking extremely good for a Champions League place, and Borussia Dortmund are now in a must-win situation, aren't they? So that'll probably be my next immediate focus.
Yeah, fantastic. Great match. I'm really looking forward to that one. I think I have to also remember, Stefan, it's the DFB Pokal this week. Some really good fixtures in that. And we're probably going to do at least one podcast this week on that, right? Sort of recapping the DFB Pokal fixtures. And then, of course, we're back with the normal transfer show. Your Substack, my Substack. Anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
No, just the usual. Thanks everyone who subscribes to the podcast, everyone who subscribes to the Substack. And as always, let us know what you guys think in the comments below. Had a really good time kind of talking to some people after the game under my article full time. And of course, great to have Matt on the show. And let us know if you'd like to have him, if you'd like us to have him back on, is what I'm trying to mutter out of my mouth. But of course, we definitely will. And yeah,
He's saying that, but you told me to turn my camera off earlier, so you can't be that keen on seeing me.
No, we're definitely going to have Matt back. He's excellent. And
Matt,
thank you so much for coming on, Matt.
You say that now, but it's my pleasure.
The reason that Manu and I don't have the cameras on when we record the show is because we speak to each other more than we speak to our respective wives, and I think having to look at each other as well is probably too much.
Oh yeah, no, we
Yeah,
do have
your words, not mine, lads. But yeah, it was a pleasure. Thanks a lot.
because we not only have this podcast, we also have the Transfermarkt stuff and meetings every week. So yeah, I made this joke. Actually, I was phoning home when you stayed with my parents, and my mom asked me if I wanted to talk to you, Stefan. I said no, I talked to him enough as it is. But yes, we'll be back soon with another show. Thanks for listening. Until next time, auf Wiedersehen.
In Sicht.
Thank you for listening to Believe. You can show support to your host by subscribing to the show and giving us a 5-star rating on your preferred platform. Check us out at Believe.com and search for BLEAV on YouTube.